Good morning. My name is Caitlin Simpson, and I have the privilege of serving on staff here at First Christian Church. I also had the privilege last week of bringing our message, continuing our summer sermon series where we talked about Jesus as a nonviolent rebel, how Jesus' ministry, in essence, his nonviolent ways, is what made him rebellious during that time. We talked about how we now are the hands and feet of Christ in this world, and so we must too become nonviolent rebels. This morning, we conclude our conversation. We conclude our summer sermon series where you chose the topics and you voted on the topics. If we recall, we started this series by talking about how to raise civil children in an uncivil world. It seems only fitting that this morning we conclude our summer sermon series by talking about children. This morning we're going to talk about the suffering of children and how we respond to that suffering. When I received the request, the item that you all voted on, it talked about that there were two specific instances around suffering of children that whomever came up with that topic wanted addressed. The first is, how do we respond to the suffering of children when it comes to school shootings? A reality in our world. And the second was, how do we respond to the suffering of children, of those children who are in detention centers across the United States? A relevant topic of our time. Suffering is not new. We have a long-standing history that includes war, and genocide, and murder, imprisonment. And the suffering of children is also not new. Across generations, throughout eras, children have suffered largely at the hands of others. Being categorized as a child in our society means that they do not have the autonomy to make decisions for themselves in the way that we do. So that means that often their suffering is at the hands of the adults around them. It's just a reality. And that suffering leaves a lasting impression, whether it's a single event or a series of events that is embodied through suffering. And what we know is that there are studies out there that teach us about the resilience of children. There's one study in particular that we've talked about on Sunday mornings, but it's called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And this is a longitudinal study across the span of many, many years that has realized that children can suffer unimaginable things and still be relatively okay, whatever okay means. But that it doesn't ruin their lives. It doesn't prevent them from being able to be happy. And that the primary thing that allows for that resiliency is when children have positive relationships with adults. That for every traumatic event, that a positive relationship with an adult can mitigate that trauma, can prevent them from having lifelong impacts due to that suffering. We know that children are resilient. My guess is that the reason that this topic came up is because we don't always know what we are supposed to do to try and help engage that suffering. Last week, when we talked about Jesus as a nonviolent rebel, the primary thing that we talked about as a pillar of Jesus' ministry was through compassion. His absolute relentlessness in offering compassion to everyone around him. And as I stated last week, this morning we continue our dialogue about compassion. Theologian Marcus Borg wrote a book called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. This is a book that we have used in various Bible studies throughout our church community. My experience with this book is by reading it as part of the Millennials small group several years ago. And even though it's been many years, I still come back to this book because I think what Marcus Borg has to say is so relevant in today's world. And you could put it up against almost any issue, but especially when we talk about suffering. Here's what Marcus Borg has to say about compassion. In terms of feeling, compassion means to feel with as even the etymology of the English word suggests that passion comes from the Latin word that means to feel. And the prefix "cum" means with, to feel with. Compassion thus means feeling the feelings of somebody else in a visceral way, at a level somewhere below the level of the head. Most commonly, compassion is associated with feeling the suffering of somebody else and being moved by that suffering to do something. I love what the Latin teaches us here. Compassion means to feel with, to feel in such a visceral way that it goes beneath the head level. Right? It goes well beyond our thinking brain and our processing brain, and it goes into our heart, to those heartstrings that often guide us. When Marcus Borg is talking about compassion, he's talking about the kind of compassion that calls us to use our heartstrings, to disengage our thinking brain and just feel with someone. This is the kind of feeling that goes beneath the surface. This is the kind of feeling that requires vulnerability. And we have talked about vulnerability from this pulpit, from community events, from Bible studies, since I first became introduced with First Christian Church. And I think we continue to talk about vulnerability because it is so difficult to figure out how to do. Because if we talk about genuine vulnerability, then we're talking about letting down our barriers. We're talking about letting down our protective fields, the things that keep us safe from judgment or frustration or discomfort. And we're talking about releasing those and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable with one another. And it's hard. We don't want to do it because it's risky. What if we get rejected? What if we get judged? But if we want to be vulnerable with someone, the first step is to be present with them. And if we're going to be present with someone, we have to remove the barriers that distract us. Being present with someone is the best way to respond to suffering. It's the first step. It's vital. You can't respond to suffering if you're not present. And one of the ways in which we can be present with people is to listen to them, to listen to what they have to say. Compassion can manifest in a lot of different ways. If we look around this room and we look at these pictures of the ways in which our church community has been compassionate in our community, we know that one size doesn't fit all. But the kind of compassion that allows us to feel with people, it has to start with being present and listening to them and being vulnerable, and at the core of being willing to believe the stories that we hear. It is so easy to want to reject a story someone has told us, something that is too awful, too terrible. We have this sort of knee-jerk reaction, go, oh, maybe you misread that. Maybe that's not what really happened. But if we want to be vulnerable with people and we want to really listen to them, we have to honor their stories. We have to resist the temptation to invalidate them. And I think the best way to do this is to do what I'm calling to do listening with endurance. Endurance listening. To resist the temptation to tune things out when it gets to be too overwhelming. And this is so hard for me. It's one of the larger struggles of my life, especially when it comes to listening to things like the news. I don't like the news. It is sad. It is overwhelming. And there is so much happening in the news that I cannot control. And I don't like that. So I would much rather watch a TV show that allows me to zone out and think of nothing than have to sit there and listen to stories of suffering happen on my screen over and over and over again. But if we're going to practice this endurance listening, then we have to listen to things like the news. And we have to listen for more than just those single events. There's no doubt when a school shooting happens, It overwhelms every news feed across platforms. It's everywhere. And it might be everywhere for a few days, maybe even a week. But then what? It gets replaced by a different story. And then that story gets replaced by another story. But what happens to those original stories, to the people impacted by that school shooting in the weeks and months and years following it? Did their suffering stop when the news stopped covering it? We know that the answer is no. We know that the suffering persists, and so we must also be persistent in our listening. It has to go beyond a single event. We have to develop the kind of endurance listening where we continue to listen for those weeks and months and years after that event. We cannot go with the norm of mainstream media and constantly get distracted and move on to the next story. Because the reality is, the children who are impacted by that suffering, by the suffering of school shootings or the suffering of abuse or the suffering of being forced to stay in detention centers, those children cannot change the channel. They do not have an escape from their suffering. And whatever other stories are out there, it does not overwhelm their suffering. It doesn't take it away. It's their reality. So we must stay the course. It only seems fair that if we're going to talk about endurance listening, that we practice it this morning. So we're going to. We're going to practice it in two ways. The first way is by listening with our eyes. I'm going to show you a collection of images from a detention center, from children. The second is through listening with our eyes and our ears. I'm going to show you a 2-minute video that is connected to school shootings. There is no doubt that these images and that video are going to elicit a response. And for as many people are in this room, that is probably how many responses we will have. The purpose is not for you all to respond the same way. The purpose is for you to continue to listen even when it's hard. And listen to what's happening in your mind and in your body. Do you feel angry? Do you feel frustrated, sad? Do you feel despondent? Do you feel apathetic? What's happening in your physical body? Are your palms sweaty? Is your heart racing? Listen to what's happening, and then try and figure out, where's the root of that? If you're angry, where is that rooted? The last thing I will say about this before we get started is this. It is so easy, especially in today's world, to politicize these issues. There is no doubt that the issue around gun control is political. And there's no doubt that the issue around immigration status is political, and the policies around human trafficking and what goes in and what comes out, those are political. But that is not what we are talking about this morning. This morning we are talking about the suffering of children. And children are not political. So even if right now you have something playing in your head, where you're already coming up with your reason as to why the politician you support or the policies you support are the right ones to address this issue and that policy, all I can say to you is great. It's great that you have thoughts and feelings about policies. That's not the purpose of what we're doing this morning. So do your best to stay in the moment and stay grounded to our task, which is to listen with endurance about the suffering that children are experiencing. The first set of images we're going to see come from a detention center in El Paso, Texas. Children were working with psychiatrists and pediatricians to process their experience. The drawings that you're about to see are drawings that children did of what, when they were asked to draw their home, what home was for them. There's no doubt in my mind, as we look at these images, that what these children are depicting with total clarity is jail. In their mind, whatever they think jail looks like, this is what they're drawing. And that could be happening for a lot of different reasons. It could just be that the center that they're staying in is housed in a former jail, and so that's what they're seeing. It could be that the experiences that they've had in those detention centers feel like what they think jail is, and so they're drawing that. Again, this isn't about what's the right way or the wrong way to put a detention center together. The purpose is to look at these images and realize that this is the experience of the children who have been in those detention centers. And I don't know about you, but when I was a child, I was taught that jail is where bad people went. Jail was used as a deterrent to be good, right? Don't be bad, you'll go to jail. Be good, you don't go to jail. So I can't help but wonder, as I see these images from these children, about what is happening in their psyche. That even if they were there for 12 hours, or 24 hours, or 4 weeks, that no matter how long they were there, that their temporary home, they felt like it was a jail. What does that do to a child? What are the long-term impacts of that for a child? Because when we look at these images, there are no toys depicted. There's no sense of playing. There are no meals. It's just bars and people. And if we think about these children, if they have been taught, like I was taught, like many of us were taught, that bad people go to jail, do they think they are bad if they're in a place that's like jail? Do they know why they're there? Do they know where their parents are or their family members? Do they have any idea how long they're going to be there? The answer is no, right? And that we just don't know because their stories are not being told. And if they're being told, are we listening? Have we been listening? Again, this is not about policy. I'm not standing up here telling you that I've got all of the answers on immigration policy because I do not. But what I can tell you is that children are suffering. And they're having long-term impacts due to that suffering. So we need to keep listening to see what we can do. Now again, hopefully you're thinking about what you're feeling in these moments. What's happening inside of you and in your mind, with your body. And I wish I could tell you that our practice is over, but it's not. We're going to watch a video in a moment. And this video is a video that depicts two adults what to do in the event of a school shooting. These adults are brought in a room and they're told that they're going to be taught what to do in the event of a school shooting and that the people putting on the event are going to bring in an expert to teach them about it. It is a difficult video to watch. I've watched it several times in preparation for this sermon, and every time I'm just uncomfortable. Do your best to stay in the moment. Resist the temptation to disengage. Because the children who are suffering due to school shootings cannot disengage. It's intense. There's a lot of emotion conveyed in that video. And this is the reality of the children who are attending schools in the United States. Wise professionals have taught them these drills to help them figure out how to stay alive. It is a reality. And it isn't like students like Kaylee go through this drill one time. It's not a single event drill. Children have repeated drills throughout their school year for the entirety of their schooling. And it doesn't just stop when they end grade school. Because if any of you know someone who's attending a college campus, you know that there are active shooter drills throughout the year to try and teach students how to stay alive. And because they help students stay alive, we're grateful for these drills. I didn't show you this video to try and say that these drills are horrible. They're not. But it doesn't mean that these drills don't cause suffering. They do. They keep people alive, but they also can cause suffering. The suffering that happens when our children live in a world where they have to go to school bearing the weight of wondering whether or not they're going to be safe there. When they have to go to school and wonder if today will be the day that they have to use that drill. And I just can't imagine the burden. I did not grow up in that time. I did not grow up in a time where we had active shooter drills. And I can't imagine what it must feel like to carry the weight of that reality to school with you. How does it impact their daily interactions? How does that impact their learning? And those are just for the children who only ever have to use this as a drill. I cannot even comprehend the level of suffering that exists for children who have actually experienced a school shooting. This is why we have to listen with endurance, so that we can hear what the children are telling us, even when they don't know the words. We have to listen to the suffering that is happening, and we have to make sure and not get distracted. As you can see from this video, the adults had a variety of reactions to this. Some of them looked shocked that a child was being brought in as an expert. Some of them were suppressing some uncomfortable giggles as she began to lead them through the drill. You saw some people were crying and getting emotional, and some just stood there silent. But they stayed. They didn't leave the room or change the channel because it was too uncomfortable. They continued to listen. The reality is that the stories of our children, stories like this, are often getting lost and tangled up in the political issues wrapped up with them. We are falling prey to the temptation to make this about choosing sides and to make this about politicians. And while we wait to see who will win, the suffering of our children persists. And this is where we have to finish what Borg teaches us. Most commonly, compassion is associated with feeling the suffering of somebody else and being moved by that suffering to do something. We are called to do something. And what we know from our learnings about Jesus is that Jesus often called people to have compassion, to feel with them. And I love what Jesus has to say in particular about children. In the Gospel of Matthew, there's a story about children that most, if not all of us, have heard before, where Jesus is walking down the road and he's talking with Pharisees, and they're probably talking about policies, and the Pharisees are trying to get Jesus to agree to something that they believe is vital. And in that moment, Scripture tells us that then small children were brought to Jesus so he could lay hands on them and pray for them. And the disciples began to scold the parents. But Jesus said, "Let the children alone. Let them come to me. The kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." And after laying his hands on them, Jesus left that town. So here Jesus is having a really important conversation with adults. And these children come in, these parents bring their children, and even the disciples, their first reaction is to be like, no, take these children away. This is a conversation for adults. Right? And the Pharisees, no doubt, are like, yeah, get these kids out of here. But Jesus says, no, let those children come to me. Because of everything that we're talking about right now, the most important thing that we could be engaging right now are our children. So Jesus does that. He hears them, he blesses them, and then he leaves because his work is done. Jesus teaches us in this moment that there is nothing more important, no dialogue more important than engaging with our children and making sure that they are okay. He completely ignores everything else. So when we think about this question, how do we respond to the suffering of children? The best way is to refuse to allow children to get lost in the political arguments of adults. We have to refuse the temptation to be distracted by the next incoming story on our news feed and stay the course. We have to stay in the moment and listen with endurance and use the kind of compassion that allows us to feel with those children in their suffering. We must act by learning more, by refusing to be distracted, and by holding people accountable who should be. By holding people accountable who perpetuate the suffering of children for whatever reason. And this is where it gets messy. This is where a lot of times it starts to get political. And I cannot undo that for you. I can't untangle the issues around policy from the suffering of children and the way in which it gets messy. I can't do that. But what I can do is remind each of us what Jesus taught us, which is that above all else, our focus should be on our children. And right now, our children are suffering. And it is up to us whether we live into our call to do something about it. So here's my challenge for you. Will we listen with endurance? Will we use compassion to feel with children as they suffer? And will we lead that listening into action? Will we be like Jesus and disrupt whatever debates that we're having among ourselves and instead keep the focus on our children? I pray that we do. Amen.